Hello everybody, welcome to the second part of our unit on the philosophy of religion, or metaphysics and the philosophy of religion. This week we're looking at the teleological argument. Last week we looked at the ontological argument and sort of cosmological as well. And we're looking in particular at a philosopher called Richard Dawkins, and we're looking at something called analogical thought. So there's some new concepts, but we'll also be going back over some of the other terms. I'm wrapping up, or I'm pulling together some of the concept that you learned in Unit 2 and working towards your midterm, which will be coming up in a week or so. So this week we're turning to the argument for God's non-existence. So for last week we looked at arguments for the existence of God. This week we're looking at arguments for the fact that God does not exist. And we're looking at Richard Dawkins, who's a contemporary philosopher. He's actually quite prolific. We're reading his book called The Blind Watchmaker, subtitled Why the Evidence of Evolution Reveals a Universe Without Design. And he also wrote a book called The God Delusion. And if you look on YouTube, there are quite a few debates that he's been part of. Now, I've given you a whole PDF of The Blind Watchmaker, and I've also given you a PDF file of just the 17 pages or so that we're reading out of the whole book. If you're interested, feel free, of course, to read the whole book, but I've just put in a separate file the sections that you need to read. Now, he starts The Blind Watchmaker with quotes from a theologian and philosopher called William Paley, who wrote something called Natural Theology in around 1800. And in his book, William Paley argues that by studying nature, you can see that it's been created by intelligent design. And Dawkins ends up starting with Paley, which is very central to his argument, but then rejects this teleological argument. Teleological argument is also called the design argument, and he says that it has a false premise in it. Now, I'm going to be referring to Paley quite a bit in this lecture, as well as David Hume, and I put them in as optional readings for you, but it's necessary to talk about Paley in order to talk about Dawkins, but I didn't want to give you too much reading. So if you're interested, feel free to look at those optional readings. Otherwise, I think from what I explain in this lecture, you can get what it's all about. So let's do a quick summary. We talked about Anselm Aquinas, and also I'm going to add Paley in here, who argue that there are things we can't know. And because we don't know these things and we don't have explanations for these things that we observe, there's got to be a higher power. In the modern period, the 17th century, 18th century, philosophers started becoming more interested in this inductive reasoning. It's associated with science, it's starting with these observations and experiences, and from there you extrapolate a claim for truth, right? A hypothesis. And so it's based on this a posteriori knowledge. It is a form of inductive reasoning, and some people say that Paley's making inductive, other people say no, he's making deductive. But anyway, don't forget that the difference between inductive and deductive has to do with the relationship between the author to the claim they're making. An inductive argument starts with the premise which supports a probable truth, right? Not the guaranteed truth. The author, scientist, philosopher who's making an inductive claim is basically making the argument that if the premise I've started with is true, and if there are strong enough claims, then the conclusion I arrive at is unlikely to be proven as a false conclusion. So rather than saying the deductive is the premise establishes the truth of the conclusion, this is the premise establishes the fact that my conclusion is unlikely to be proven as false, right? So there's a more of unlikely versus is. And another thing that you need to know is that Paley argues that you could reveal the truth about God through a reflection on nature. Right? And if you study nature, you'll understand that there's an intelligent design behind nature. So he's relying on what we would call a posteriori sort of knowledge and reasoning, that he's looking at things, observing things around the world, but he's also using an analogical reasoning. And here I'm going to take a little detour into something called analogical thought. Now, there's a philosopher called Michel Foucault, he was French, who argued that various periods of history are characterized by different, what he would call conditions of truth, or different discourses, which is kind of a collection of statements made about something. And these determine what's possible or acceptable to affirm as truth. So, in other words, there's different ways of arriving at or seeing the world, and therefore what's affirmable as truth. It's been seen that basically medieval through Renaissance period, or medieval through what we would call the modern period, Western knowledge is constructed by a series of resemblances or analogical thought. Right? So things that seem similar to each other is the predominant way, or had been the predominant way of experiencing the world. And I've given you some links to something called the Elizabethan World Picture, some illustrations, which I should have shown right now, that a lot of times they're drawn in circles, where you have the sort of divine world out here, then you've got the angels, and then you've got men, then you've got animals, then you've got the like rocks and minerals and things. And the idea was that each one of these is kind of a mirror for the other. And if you understand the relationship between one set of relationships, like say between humans, then you can just generalize out towards the divine, right? So if you understand one realm, you can understand another one, specifically the celestial. Everything's created from the same thumbprint, i.e. God's thumbprint. Therefore, there's an analogy, there's a correspondence from one part to another part. Now, analogical reasoning is actually quite fundamental to human thought, and people have even argued animals as well are capable of analogical reasoning. It's very important in fields of ethnology and history and science, pretty well everywhere where you try to say, we understand why people did this thing, so maybe that's like, we know what the people do now, so that's probably what they did in the past, right? Or we understand the law of thermodynamics, so therefore we can generalize from this situation to that situation, right? So analogical reasoning is quite fundamental to how people work and think. Now, it relies on inductive reasoning. This thing is like some other thing because we have observed these different similarities, and we can observe all these little things and put forward this justification. Now, some people say that analogical arguments rely on a priori justification, and that would be when, with a proposition, that you're arguing that these sort of things, the propositions in this thing I'm examining are the same in this thing I'm examining. So we're talking about a priori and that sort of universal generalized theory that holds true across situations, right? It's the same here as it is there as it is there. So when we're talking about a priori, we mean that kind of justification. Now let's go back to William Paley, who's, as I said, that 18th century, I guess he'd be 19th century theologian and philosopher. Anyway, he's doing something quite new there. He's not just relying on an ontological argument like Anselm, or the teleological argument of Aquinas, which I think is his fifth way, if I didn't mess that one up. It's either the fourth or fifth way. So Paley's making an a posteriori argument from experience, based on observing nature. And he says if you look how complex nature is, the only possible conclusion that you can arrive at is there's got to be some sort of intelligence, some sort of maker behind nature. Things can't be by accident. They're too complex. He's also making an analogy. He compares two different things and he draws a conclusion or a synthesis between these two different things. And the two things he makes a conclusion between is a watch and nature. And he says, look at this watch here. If you open it up, you can see all the gears. You see everything works for a purpose, right? For the watch to run. And somebody had to make this watch, and that would be the watchmaker. And then he says, well, if you look at nature, it's incredibly complex. It seems to have a purpose. So there's got to be a designer of nature, and that designer of nature would be God. And he's making what I said last week, I told you about the three forms of argument for God's existence. So he's making a teleological argument. Everything tends towards a purpose or an end, and obviously this end would be God, right? So the universe exhibits some sort of end, some sort of purpose that it's all sort of headed towards. Now, if you were to diagram Paley's argument, I know you're not looking at it, but here's basically his argument diagram, right? Human artifacts are products of intelligent design. They have a purpose. The universe resembles human artifacts. This is where the analogy comes in. Therefore, it's probable that the universe is a product of intelligent design. It has a purpose. However, the universe is vastly more complex and gigantic than human artifact is. And there's his ultimate conclusion. Therefore, there is probably a powerful, vastly intelligent designer who created the universe. So he's making a very brilliant argument. He's using this a posteriori knowledge, which is reasoning through experience. He's wedding it to this analogical tool, right, that God is to nature as a watchmaker is to a watch. And he's grounding that in sort of a priori thought, this idea that one thing we can make the propositions about this statement are the same as about that one, to come up with what he claims is this teleological proof of God's existence, right? There is intelligence, there's a purpose to the world, and that's obviously God's done it. Now I'm going to take a little detour through David Hume, and he wanted to show that there's no... Hume and Paley were writing around the same time. They actually swapped manuscripts. Hume read Paley's manuscript. And Hume wanted to say there's no possible way to prove that God exists through an a posteriori argument, which is what Paley's kind of arguing. He's saying it's a posteriori relies on experience, but humans can't possibly experience the truth of God. He says humans can only make analogies, and he also says that it's ridiculous to argue from parts towards a whole, right? Watch being the part and the whole being the God. He says that's false form of reasoning or analogies. And he says that people, they kind of use synthesis to compare two separate things, but analogies and synthesis is only hypothetical. There is no provable connection, and therefore it's impossible to prove that God exists using an a posteriori and analogical argument. The only argument that you could use to prove God's existence is the a priori argument, which he would also see as those relations of ideas. And therefore he says that a posteriori arguments or matters of fact argument for intelligent design can't be proven. So he would only go back to it can only be an a priori kind of analytic statement like Anselm made. Those are the only ones that are kind of logically valid. Now Dawkins. Basically Dawkins is 180 degrees from St. Anselm. Anselm said that atheism is an unsupportable position and therefore there's no other logical choice but to believe in God. Dawkins flips that on its head and he says that basically believing in God is an unsupportable position, so there's no logical choice but to believe that God does not exist. And he does this through Darwin's theory of evolution. And I've given you some YouTube clips that you can watch, which might help, will complement the reading I've asked you to do. And so Dawkins also does this kind of complex thing where he's using, a lot of evidence, which would be kind of a posteriori. He's attempting to use deductive reasoning, but which is really inductive because he's using a posteriori and synthetic, right? It's kind of this world in which we don't know for sure what's happening. And he ends up making a posteriori reasoning to come to an inductive conclusion. So he's doing a lot of different things where he thinks he's using deductive, but is really using inductive, and he comes to an inductive conclusion that God doesn't exist. And here's his thing, right? He wants to persuade the reader that not just that the Darwinian worldview happens to be true, but it's the only known theory which could, in principle, solve the mystery of our universe, right? So that sort of, it could, in principle, solve it. That's kind of not a very strong statement. And he basically says that philosophy can't prove God as a fact, since there are other more logical explanations to explain the complexity of the universe, and therefore it's not logical to state that God exists. So I'm going to go through some of the points that as you're reading, these will be necessary for you to pay attention to. So as I said, he really relies not only on Paley but also on Darwin. And Darwin says that nature doesn't know where it's headed, it's not teleological, it's just accidental. At the same time, this doesn't mean that evolution is chance or random. And the thing he says here is very key is cumulative selection rather than natural selection. So the key term here is cumulative selection is non-random. We just don't know where it's going. So it appears random to us, but it isn't really. And so Dawkins says that the theory of cumulative selection shows that the complexity of life can happen without any intelligent design sort of behind it. And if you take away the need to explain the complexity of life, then you take away the need for God, because there is some other, I guess you could say, if you take away the need to explain the complexity of life through an external being rather than just cumulative selection. And this is where that computer-generated sentence, "me think like a weasel," is key for Dawkins' argument. This is his analogy to cumulative selection, the same way that Paley had the analogy of the watch. So Dawkins, I hope you can see, just turns upside down Paley's argument, and it's actually David Hume that paves the way for Dawkins to be able to make this argument. This is why I had to bring up Hume. Right? Hume says it could possibly be arbitrary because it's the act of the human mind to see effects or relationships between sets of things, right? So humans just want to see that there's a connection, there's an analogy, but it could be an arbitrary chance, right? And this is how you connect from Paley to Hume to Darwin to Dawkins' argument. So in other words, analogical thought can lead you to see similarities and therefore to make unsound deductive claims. So to conclude this unit, I'd like you to keep in mind the similarities between Dawkins and Paley, and I guess Anselm and Aquinas, and the process that they go through to try to prove God's existence or non-existence. And just Paley relies on the watch as an analogy with nature in order to show that the complexity of the watch can't be accidental, therefore must be intelligently designed, and therefore by analogy the universe or nature's got to be the same as well. There's got to be somebody who designed it. Dawkins is also making an inductive argument that relies on analogical thought. That sentence there, his me thinks is like a weasel, which is a computer-generated form of reproduction, and he shows how that's a non-random change, right? Cumulative selection is a series of non-random changes, and that's analogy for how nature, the universe, works. And so what he's saying is that analogy is an incredibly important critical tool, way of reasoning, right? Dawkins and Paley, as well as Aquinas, because I think we could throw Aquinas in here as under analogy as well. They hold opposite positions, but they're using a similar reasoning method to support their epistemology, right? They're using a similar reasoning method to support the truth they arrive at, even though it's the completely opposite truth. So I hope that you can see how this works. What I'd like you to do in your posts this week is to read 2 articles and try to see if the authors of those articles, do they hold opposite positions but arrive at them through similar methods, or maybe they use different methods and arrive at the same truth, right? It's possible to kind of get to an answer through similar ways, but you arrive at a different answer, just the same ways you could arrive at 2 different answers through a similar process. So I will leave it at this. I hope you enjoy the reading.